Let's get into this, because the last 48 hours in the Iran war have been some of the most dangerous of the entire campaign. And if you've been following the day-by-day escalation, you already know this thing has stopped being a limited response a long time ago. As of this week, we're sitting somewhere around day 150 of the conflict, and what just happened isn't a footnote. It's a full-blown declaration that the ceasefire era is dead. So grab a coffee, settle in, because we're going to break this down the way a fighter pilot breaks down a strike package and the way a JTAC breaks down a target list. And by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why this war just took a sharp turn upward. Here's the sequence. Iran fired multiple ballistic missiles at a U.S. military installation in Jordan. An attempted surprise attack aimed at American forces stationed in the region. Every single missile got intercepted. Jordanian air defenses knocked down several more that crossed into their airspace before they ever got close to a populated area. Nobody died on the American or Jordanian side that night. But that's not the part that matters. What matters is that Iran tried it on purpose during a pause in hostilities that both sides had more or less been observing. And within about 18 hours, the United States answered with what Central Command called a heavy wave of strikes. A 2-hour operation hitting dozens of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps targets across Iran, including military command centers, missile and drone production facilities, coastal surveillance sites, and maritime assets tied to the harassment campaign in the Strait of Hormuz. That's not a symbolic slap. That's a full package. And it ended a 5-night pause in strikes that a lot of analysts thought might actually hold. Now let's talk about how we even got to this pause in the first place. Because context matters here more than almost anywhere else in this war. A short time before the Jordan attack, the Trump administration had said publicly that the U.S. halted new strikes at the request of the Iranian regime, with a warning attached that attacks would resume immediately if a new ceasefire deal wasn't reached. That's a pretty generous offer, all things considered, given everything that had already happened in the preceding weeks. And how did Iran respond to that generosity? They used the 5 nights of quiet to reload and launch a ballistic missile strike at a U.S. base. So when the president went on camera afterward and told reporters it was our turn to hit them and that Iran knew it was coming, that wasn't just tough talk for the cameras. That was the administration explicitly telling you the rules of engagement had just reset to maximum pressure. And you have to sit with the timing for a second, because it tells you something about how the Iranian leadership actually thinks. They had 5 nights of zero incoming fire. 5 nights to just sit there, breathe, regroup, maybe use that opening to actually push toward a real deal. Instead, the IRGC used that window to plan and execute a strike on American forces. That's not a regime negotiating from a position of strength looking for an off-ramp. That's a regime that fundamentally does not know how to stop escalating, even when de-escalation is being handed to them on a plate. It's the geopolitical equivalent of someone giving you 5 days off work with pay, and you decide to spend that time breaking into their house. So let's get into the strike package itself, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting from a fighter pilot's perspective. When Central Command says heavy wave, that's not marketing language, that's a real operational category, and it tells you something specific about scale and intent. A heavy wave means multiple strike packages hitting simultaneously or in close sequence across a wide geographic spread, not a single flight of aircraft popping 1 or 2 targets and heading home. We're talking about dozens of IRGC targets in one continuous 2-hour window. From a planning perspective, that requires deconfliction across multiple squadrons, tanker support to keep aircraft fueled through that entire window, suppression of enemy air defense running in parallel so nobody's getting painted by a leftover radar site, and a target list that's already been vetted, prioritized, and assigned before the first jet ever leaves the carrier deck. This is not something you improvise. This is something you build for days, and then you execute the second the order comes down. Now, what's actually in that strike package matters just as much as how big it is. Based on what's been shown in the footage that's come out of this campaign, you're looking at a mix of F-18 Super Hornets flying off the carrier, doing the bulk of the tactical strike work, alongside land-based fighters running longer-range missions into the interior. The munitions being used lean heavily on small-diameter bombs, the 250-pound class precision weapons that fold their fins out after release and glide onto the target with GPS or laser guidance. Why does that matter to a fighter pilot? Because small diameter bombs let you carry way more munitions per aircraft than older, heavier bombs, which means fewer sorties needed to service the same number of targets, which means less exposure time in contested airspace. If you're the mission planner, that's exactly the trade-off you want when you're trying to hit dozens of aim points in one continuous operation instead of stretching it out over multiple nights. Alongside those, you've got Hellfire missiles doing precision work against smaller high-value point targets. The kind of thing where you don't want a 250-pound warhead going off. You want something surgical that takes out one vehicle or one radar dish without cratering half a city block around it. And this campaign has also introduced something genuinely new to the fight: one-way attack sea drones deployed for the first time, specifically to go after Iranian small boats and coastal maritime assets in and around the Strait of Hormuz. That's a big deal, because it means the US isn't just relying on manned aircraft and traditional naval assets to police that waterway anymore. It's building an unmanned layer specifically tuned to hunt the fast attack boats and mine-laying vessels that Iran has been using to harass shipping traffic. Think of it as expanding the kill web downward, adding a cheap, expendable, always available option for the kind of small, fast, annoying targets that aren't worth risking a multi-million-dollar aircraft on. Here's where the JTAC side of this really comes into focus, because everyone loves talking about the jets and the missiles, but none of that works without the people on the ground, and in the loop, actually building the target list and confirming what's about to get hit. A joint terminal attack controller's entire job, at the most basic level, is controlling, coordinating, and clearing airstrikes so that the right target gets hit at the right time with the right weapon, and nothing gets hit that shouldn't. In a campaign moving at this pace, with dozens of targets serviced in a single 2-hour window, that coordination function becomes the actual bottleneck of the entire operation. It's not how fast the jets can fly or how many bombs they can carry. It's how fast you can positively identify a target, deconflict it against friendly forces and civilian structures nearby, get the clearance authority signed off, and pass that solution to an aircraft that's already inbound. Do that wrong even once at this scale, and you get a strike on the wrong target, or worse, a strike on your own people. And that risk isn't theoretical in this war. Earlier in the conflict, during Iran's retaliatory strikes on Kuwait, a friendly fire incident happened where a Kuwaiti Air Force jet shot down 3 American F-15Es in the chaos of that engagement. The American crews survived, which is genuinely fortunate given how that could have gone, but that single incident tells you everything about why coordination discipline matters so much. Once a conflict like this reaches this tempo, when you've got multiple nations flying intercept missions simultaneously against incoming ballistic missiles and drones in contested airspace, at night, under real pressure, the margin between a clean intercept and a friendly fire tragedy gets razor thin. That's precisely the kind of chaos a JTAC and an integrated air defense coordination cell exists to prevent, and it's precisely why, even with all the advanced sensors and radar warning receivers modern platforms carry, human coordination discipline still decides whether an operation like this stays clean or turns into a disaster. Let's also talk about what's happening on the electronic warfare side of this fight, because Iran hasn't been sitting there taking hits passively. Their air defense network still includes Russian-supplied S-300 systems and their domestically built Bavar 373 equivalent layered surface-to-air missile coverage that on paper looks like a real threat. But here's the physics problem that never goes away for any air defense network built like this, and it's the same problem it's always been. The instant a radar illuminates a target to get a fire control solution, it broadcasts its own position to every signals intelligence platform listening in the theater. And there are a lot of those platforms listening right now. Aircraft equipped with radar warning receivers detect the emission the moment it fires up, geolocate the site, and either jam it, evade it, or hand its coordinates to a strike aircraft in the same data link transmission. So every time an Iranian battery turns its radar on to try to challenge an incoming strike package, it's essentially raising its hand and volunteering to be the next target on tonight's list. Now let's zoom out to the global roundup section of what's actually going on around this, because the Jordan strike and the heavy wave retaliation didn't happen in a vacuum. Iran's response wasn't limited to that one missile salvo. Jordanian air defenses shot down a second 5-missile volley the following night, marking back-to-back nights of intercepted attacks. And Kuwait reported its own strike, an Iranian hit on a building linked to a Chinese company operating in the northern part of the country, killing a worker. Kuwait's defense ministry called it a heinous act of aggression, and honestly, that's a pretty restrained way to describe getting hit with a missile while you're not even a direct combatant in this fight. Kuwait keeps getting dragged into this because of geography and because it hosts a significant American troop presence, and Iran keeps treating that hosting arrangement as justification to strike Kuwaiti territory directly, which, again, is not exactly a sovereignty argument that holds up to any kind of scrutiny. Then there's the Iraq angle, which is its own mess entirely. In response to attacks on American forces and on Saudi oil infrastructure, the US and Saudi Arabia coordinated joint strikes against Iran-aligned militia targets inside Iraq. That triggered immediate political backlash from multiple factions in Iraqi politics, including a former prime minister, publicly warning against what he called a dangerous breach of regional solidarity. So now you've got a scenario where American and Saudi air power is operating inside Iraqi territory to hit Iranian proxies, while the Iraqi government itself is caught in the middle, publicly protesting strikes it arguably has very limited ability to actually stop. That's the proxy war layer of this conflict. and it's spreading geographically in a way that should concern anyone hoping this stays contained to Iran's own borders. And there's a piece of this that doesn't get nearly enough attention, which is the intelligence sharing relationship between Russia and Iran throughout this campaign. There's been a documented pattern connecting Russian satellite surveillance of regional facilities with the timing of Iranian strikes, both before the attacks happen and afterward when Iran is trying to assess how much damage it actually did. Ukrainian officials have specifically pointed to satellite coverage over air bases in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait, lining up suspiciously well with subsequent Iranian targeting. So while Moscow isn't putting weapons directly into Iranian hands the way some had feared, what they appear to be providing instead is something almost as valuable in modern warfare, which is targeting data and battle damage assessment support. That's the quiet, less flashy way a foreign power props up an ally without technically handing over hardware that would trigger a much bigger diplomatic response. While all of this is happening militarily, don't lose sight of what's happening on the financial side of the pressure campaign either, because that's arguably going to matter just as much in the long run as any single night of airstrikes. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned 2 Iranian firms tied to an IRGC-backed scheme that's been forcing commercial vessels to purchase insurance just to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Think about what that actually means for a second. Iran doesn't have to sink a tanker to extract value from that waterway. All it has to do is create enough perceived risk that shipping companies feel compelled to pay a toll dressed up as an insurance premium, funneling money straight into a revolutionary guard-linked financial network. That's an extortion racket wearing a business suit, and the Treasury designation is a direct attempt to choke off that revenue stream at the source, rather than waiting for another tanker incident to justify a response. So here's the honest strategic picture, and this is worth sitting with for a minute, because it explains basically everything else you're watching unfold. Iran's stated objective throughout this entire war has been sanctions relief and de facto control over traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. But what the regime actually needs, more urgently than either of those things, is a way to look like it's still standing while its actual military capability keeps getting hollowed out night after night. That's why the rhetoric from Tehran keeps escalating, even as its real capacity to project force keeps shrinking. Every ballistic missile launch, every claim of a downed aircraft, every furious statement from an IRGC spokesperson serves the same domestic purpose, which is convincing the Iranian public and the regime's remaining loyalists that they're still fighting back effectively, even when the actual battlefield picture says otherwise. And that's also why negotiations keep collapsing right when they seem closest to landing. Every time there's real diplomatic movement, whether that's a memorandum of understanding or a 5-night pause in strikes, some element of the Iranian military establishment finds a reason to blow it up, sometimes literally. It happened with the Jordan missile attack, and if you go back through this war's timeline, it's happened multiple times before that too. There's a pattern where Iran's actual negotiating team is in one room trying to land a deal, while a completely separate wing of the military apparatus is off running its own parallel foreign policy through missile launches and drone strikes. Whether that's coordinated strategy designed to keep pressure on the table during talks, or genuine internal fracturing between political leadership and military commanders who don't trust the process, either way, it produces the exact same outcome, which is a regime that has never actually been able to close out a negotiation without someone on their own side sabotaging it first. There's also a deeper structural reason this keeps happening, and it comes down to how Iran's military leadership has been operating since the earliest days of this war. A number of senior IRGC commanders have been killed or removed over the course of this conflict, and their replacements have stepped into roles where the political cost of appearing weak is existential, not just professionally embarrassing. When you take over a command position because your predecessor got killed in a strike, and you've spent your entire tenure watching the diplomatic track fail to protect anyone in your position, you come away with a very specific lesson learned, which is that missiles and radar batteries feel more reliable to you than signatures on paper. That mindset produces exactly the kind of freelancing and unauthorized escalation that keeps torching ceasefire windows before they can stabilize into anything durable. Now, before we keep going, if you're finding this breakdown useful, this is exactly the kind of thing worth sharing with someone who's been trying to follow this war, but keeps getting lost in the headline noise without any of the actual military context behind it. Drop a like if the technical side of this is landing for you, and if there's a specific piece of this campaign you want broken down in more depth, whether that's the munitions, the air defense side, or the broader regional politics, say so in the comments, because that actually shapes what gets covered going forward. Let's also talk about the Houthi dimension, because this war keeps threatening to open new fronts, and the Red Sea is the most likely candidate for the next one. Renewed fighting between the Iran-backed Houthi movement in Yemen and Saudi Arabia carries real risk of dragging in yet another active front, with consequences that would ripple well beyond the immediate region given how much global shipping already routes through that corridor. Saudi authorities have already issued danger warnings along Red Sea coastal areas, and a Saudi vessel sustained hull damage in an attack in those waters. If the Houthis escalate meaningfully while the Strait of Hormuz situation remains this volatile, you're looking at two of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet becoming simultaneously contested. And that's the kind of scenario that stops being a regional story and starts becoming a global economic one very quickly. Let's bring this back to the tactical level for a second, because there's a piece of this that deserves more attention than it usually gets, which is just how much more efficient this current phase of strikes has become compared to earlier in the war. Go back to the opening weeks of this conflict, and you're looking at strike packages built around larger munitions doing broader area damage. Now you're watching a campaign built almost entirely around small, precise, functional kills, meaning the goal isn't always total destruction of a target. It's disabling its function long enough that it can't be used effectively, whether that's a radar site, a command vehicle, or a drone storage facility. That shift matters because it tells you the target list has matured. Early in a campaign like this, you're hitting the obvious, easy, high-value stuff. By the time you're 150 days in, hitting dozens of targets in a single coordinated wave, you're working off a target list that's been refined through months of intelligence collection, battle damage assessment, and repeated observation of how the other side tries to reconstitute what you already destroyed. And that reconstitution behavior is worth talking about too, because Iran has gotten genuinely creative about trying to preserve what's left of its capability. There's been reporting throughout this campaign about Iran storing equipment inside already bombed out facilities, on the theory that a target already struck once looks less likely to get hit again. It's a reasonable tactic on paper: hide in the rubble, assume the enemy has moved on to fresher targets. Whether that actually works long term is a different question, because it assumes the side doing the striking isn't continuously retasking surveillance assets over previously hit sites, specifically to catch exactly that kind of behavior. In a war where satellite coverage, drone loiter time, and signals intelligence are this dense over the theater, hiding in the ashes of your last strike is a short-term trick, not a long-term survival strategy. One more thing worth flagging on the diplomatic side, because it explains some of the tension inside the Trump administration's own messaging. There's been public friction over exactly how effective the strikes on Iran's military and industrial capacity have actually been. Defense officials have faced direct questioning about earlier claims that Iran's military had been rendered combat ineffective, and have notably declined to reaffirm that assessment outright when pressed. Meanwhile, Iranian officials continue to claim their defense production lines are running at full capacity despite everything that's been hit. Neither claim can be independently verified with full confidence right now, and that gap between official messaging and battlefield reality is exactly the kind of thing that should make anyone following this war a little skeptical of confident claims coming from either side. The truth in a war like this usually sits somewhere between the two competing narratives, and it takes time, and usually satellite imagery analysis well after the fact, to figure out which claims actually hold up. So where does this actually go from here? If you're asking what the next escalation point looks like, keep your eye on three things simultaneously. First, watch the Strait of Hormuz blockade numbers, because that's the clearest real-time indicator of how much actual control the U.S. Navy has over that corridor versus how much disruption Iran is still able to cause. Every vessel redirected, disabled, or boarded tells you something about who's actually controlling that waterway in practice, regardless of what either government claims publicly. Second, watch whether the Houthi front in the Red Sea heats up in parallel, because that would represent Iran trying to open a second maritime pressure point, specifically to stretch American and allied naval resources, thinner across two choke points instead of one. And third, watch what happens with these pause and escalate cycles, because the pattern so far has been remarkably consistent. A period of quiet, followed by an Iranian provocation, followed by a disproportionate American response, and there's no obvious sign that cycle is going to break on its own without either a genuine shift inside Iran's command structure or a much more decisive military outcome that removes the regime's ability to keep restarting the cycle every few weeks. What do you think actually breaks this pattern? Does it take a ground option that finally removes the IRGC's ability to keep reconstituting its missile and drone production? Or does the economic pressure from the sanctions and the blockade eventually force a real negotiated settlement before that becomes necessary? Let me know what you think happens next, because there are genuinely different schools of thought on this among people who follow the region closely, and the comments on breakdowns like this one tend to have some of the sharper takes, precisely because so many people watching have direct operational or regional experience to draw from. If this kind of detailed breakdown is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because this war is clearly not slowing down, and there's going to be a lot more of this kind of footage and a lot more strike packages to break down in the weeks ahead. Share it with anyone you know who's been trying to follow this conflict but keeps getting lost in the surface level headlines without any of the actual military or strategic context underneath them. That's genuinely the most useful thing you can do if you want more people actually understanding what's happening here instead of just reacting to whatever clip crosses their feed that day. Bottom line, the ceasefire era of this war is over, at least for now. What we're watching is a regime that keeps proving, night after night, that it doesn't know how to stay quiet, even when quiet is being handed to it, and a military response on the other side that has gotten faster, more coordinated, and more surgical with every single wave. The fighter pilots flying these packages and the JTACs coordinating the target list behind them are operating at a tempo this war hasn't seen before. And if the last 72 hours are any indication of where this is headed, the next update on this conflict is probably not far away. Thanks for sticking with this breakdown all the way through, and we'll catch you in the next one.